back to another episode of James Bond Bitcoin Live. Double O should be 19, and if it's not, I'll go ahead and I'll change it. But today we have a very special guest, a person I've been watching for a long time. You also know I have had a treasure hunt on him as well. Brian was also the winner of that treasure hunt. But go ahead, Chris DeRose, please introduce yourself.
What's up, party people? This is Chris DeRose, and today I'll be the guest of the show, not the host, and I'm looking forward to talking about all things Bitcoin. I'm a long-timer in this space. I've got a show of my own. I write. I make interesting content. I'm an antagonist of sorts. And, you haven't heard of me, you can look me up at chrisderose.com.
Excellent. And, of course, Brian is back from shaving from last time. Please say hello, Brian.
Howdy, everybody. Sorry I missed the show on Sunday, James. It was a good show. I got to listen to it, but I couldn't partake because I was still on set. We ran long shooting on Sunday.
Now, shooting like drive-by shooting or like a movie?
Drive-by, James. You know I live in the Bronx. I keep it real, son.
Yes. I know you're a true hardcore gangster in this New York.
No, it's a feature film I'm working on. And we're about finished shooting it now, and we just ran long. That's why I'm clean shaven, like I was about a month ago.
Excellent. So let me get to Chris, because he is our special guest here, and let's focus on Chris DeRose here. And so Chris, you know, on my channel, anything goes, right? It's almost very similar to yours, but it's going to be about you this time.
Okay, so, sure. I mean. As long as we recognize that I'm the kind of special that rides the short bus, not the one that's particularly unique, then yes, I'm looking forward to it.
That's all right. Now, I'm going to go over a few things, but let me first talk about the SEC, because you wrote an open letter, and apparently the FCC might have read it, and then an SEC, I guess in return, wrote another open letter, maybe for you. What are your thoughts on that?
I like that these are like cloak and dagger games that are conducted over open airwaves, like it's a Russian agent in foreign territory or something. I mean, I've heard anecdotally that from credible sources that the SEC saw my letter, and they were already compiling information. And I wouldn't be surprised if my letter ended up in like a court document at some point. I was surprised it ended up in this particular paperwork, but yeah, I don't know that it was necessarily tailored towards me. And frankly, I don't know that I really get any credit for any sort of instigation of the matter. I think that the letter was written at a time when it needed to be written, and just after, it was a moment it was a idea whose time had come, because just after, there was like 2 days after, I want to say, there were articles in a couple places, but it's hard to tell to the degree that they were influenced by my letter and to the degree they were planning this on their own. But at the time, it was just after consensus, and a lot of the rhetoric in the air was effectively that the stock exchanges were going to be threatened in some capacity by tokens, or I think Coinbase was probably planning a large crowd fund of its own, or at least a private investor fund of its own, on the pretense that it would be a exchange of these types of the digital assets. Now, to the degree they're still planning that is very questionable. And I think too, I'm watching Ethereum grow. I'm very, very, very bearish about Ethereum, and I'm watching it grow effectively in a way that is completely untapered by the realities that is this risk of the SEC enforcement. And so I wrote this thing with all of those considerations in mind, and it was the right time to write that. And here we are, a couple months later, and a lot of those thoughts have come to pass.
Now,
so
were you at CoinCensus this year? Did you go there?
I was not. I've never been to a consensus conference, which is very funny, because I think that a lot of my antics and writings and commentary is present at every one of these places. And, I'm not exactly a warm welcome around there, because, I'm very pessimistic. I'm also perceived as a bully, which I may or may not be. That's a very complicated question. And I'm rude, and I don't particularly care to... I don't know. I just, there's like a degree of, I'd like to think it's authenticity, but maybe it's not. But I like to think that there's a degree of like not tolerating bullshit that I have, and it's incompatible with an environment where you're effectively providing a forum for prospectors and hucksters and scammers to air out their wares. So I don't think that I have a spot that fits there in any way that is, in their mind, constructive. Now, here we are, where a lot of my considerations have, in fact, had some degree of merit, if not complete merit. And so, to the degree that I'm constructive, maybe it's an opinion that should be heard, or maybe consensus has their own agenda, and that agenda is impacted by people who want to call the emperor for not having any clothes, which should be considered, I guess.
Well, Chris, that's what I like about you. You take kind of a more realistic approach ever since I've been watching you. In a lot of ways, I've learned a lot from you, from and also from being in this space as well. There's a lot of scammers. I mean, when you got something that anything goes, people will do anything. They don't give a shit, right? If they can screw you over, they will. And you see that in a lot of recently with Ethereum and all these supposed hacks, which sometimes I wonder, are they really hacks? Because they just seem like all too convenient at this time, where people are getting their private keys somehow compromised, and oops, 30 million, 80 million, 20 million, and no one's responsible. They're like, oops, sorry. And it's like, if you're a bank, like if my bank said, oops, we lost $38 million, sorry, like I would be flipping. I'd be like calling the police. I might even take my gun and go down to the bank and demand my money back. So I think you have a lot of justification over there.
Thank you.
What do you think is going to happen going forward now that you see this letter? Because they clearly make it sound like it's a warning, but at the same time they also kind of say, well, we're not gonna we're really not gonna prosecute anyone just yet. But obviously this is a clear warning to everybody that this is obviously this is a security. They use the DAO as a example, but obviously the DAO is like it's like kicking a dead horse at that time. But all these other ones, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I was talking to Meher Roy about this earlier today, and he and I couldn't have more different opinions on the subject. A lot of the people that are Ethereum believers are of the mind that there is nothing to see here, and this is just business as usual, and everybody knows that there are some bad apples, and that the DAO maybe was one of them, and that this was sort of the benevolence of the SEC to let us know that that one was in fact a bad apple, and that's the extent of what will happen from here, which that is not my opinion at all. I think that's ludicrous. My opinion is, and I'm not an attorney, but I do talk to a lot of them. My opinion is that they see that this space got too out of hand. They were their consensus. They had operatives there. There were secret agents of a fairly well-known variety there. They're not that secret. And they were checking this thing out. And they had seen that this got too far. They had seen that the size of this had grown to a degree that it should not have been permitted to grow in the first place. So I think that this letter was their way of saying, okay, guys, we have reset your Pokemon game. We're going to start a new game. The game starts today. And as of today, now we're going to treat this like we should have been treating it from a while back. But past transgressions will be forgiven. Going forward, however, you have no ability to claim ignorance. And from here on in, we are going to be a player in the space. That would be my understanding of it. So I think what's going to happen is they're going to start with the exchanges, and they're going to see who does and does not register. My suspicion is they've already got in mind an exchange or two that they want to make a case out of. Maybe that'll be Poloniex. Maybe it'll be Shapeshifter. Maybe it'll be Kraken. Maybe it'll even be Coinbase. I don't know. And I'd like to see if they are going to test the waters to see who wants to play ball. And then from there, my suspicion is that they would start going after at least one or two high-profile fundraisers that would happen at this point on in, and use those as examples to effectively squash much of the industry. That's my suspicion. And we'll see if that is actually what transpires, but that's what I would expect.
It's like they're looking for someone to make an example out of so everyone else will fall into line.
Yeah, when I first started in the Bitcoin space, I used to think in very binary terms about regulation, that like drugs are quote unquote illegal or trespassing is illegal or whatever you want. But I think that the regulators think more of a cost benefit basis in the sense that they will try to curb as much activity as possible given their limited resources. And so what they'll do is probably shake down some high profile cases with the intent of discouraging anybody from growing too large, with the intent of discouraging VCs from jumping in and VC funds from jumping in, thus reducing the overall depth of this market to something significantly smaller than it once was. And they won't stamp it out completely, but they will certainly kick it in the nuts and get those market caps way down, would be my guess.
You know what? When I look at it, I think this whole space is gonna be dead, because there's no point in doing these ICOs anymore, because now the cost of doing them will be just almost the same or even more as if you just did an IPO. And so that defeats the whole purpose, because I remember watching a lot of your videos where it seemed like it was a way to crowd source money to basically uneducated and definitely unqualified investors. And the results seem to be like people are using this platform, Ethereum, and very in particular, but there's other ones out there like Omni, Waves, Next, and even to some degree Counterparty, that people were using this to sort of treat it like some kind of Ponzi, and even a pyramid. And it seems to me like, from my research, and I'm not like a computer scientist or financial guy, but if I can just Google some stuff and just think of this as like a perpetual motion machine, I think this whole industry is dead. Any ICO that is not a donation, straight up donation, it's probably going to be taken down somewhat. So if people realize that they're participating in a charity, I doubt they would send their ethers for these tokens of appreciation. And also, I think that they've got to take some action. I mean, because if these were considered securities and people were doing these things thinking that if they changed a few words, like call them tokens, and distributed whatever tech ledger, blockchains, I think that's got to make the SEC look kind of look like they're not doing their job, because they've pretty much gotten away with the crime already by now. I mean, do you think some people will pay a heavy fine and also go to jail? And some of these people who are promoting these ICOs and getting paid to promote them, you think they're going to pay a fine as well? Do you think there's got to be a cost to their violation?
I think you'll probably have one or two cases. I don't think you'll have many cases, for a couple easy reasons. We saw like Josh Garza was a high-profile case recently where he got to, I think, 20 years on his sentence, and I thought that was actually a bit onerous personally, and I didn't like the guy's crime, but that seemed a bit much. But yeah, there'll probably be a couple. As far as the guys that are advertising, the thing about this space too, I don't think people realize, is like there's not a lot of tough guys in America. Like, these guys are going to rat out anybody. So what will end up happening probably is a lot of those advertisers and promoters will probably rat out somebody else. It would surprise me if it wasn't the guys towards the top, like guys like Josh Garza, guys like Arthur Brightman, guys like Joe Lubin, that are the guys that they end up catching and putting behind bars through the testimonies of people in marketing. Because I think that's what they want. It's like bigger, high profile guys. They don't want to stick like everybody in jail. They just want to stick like 2 or 3 guys in jail that are at the top, so that people understand that's what happens to the guy at the top, which is probably a good way to do things. I also, the thing about the ICO market is it was a lot more complicated than people realize. The narrative that I think everybody wanted to pass around was that of the average Joe who got into on some like ICO, some hot product thing, propelled to riches, and then walked out and sold to greater fools, and that was the end. But that rarely happened. That may have happened with Ethereum, but that was fairly rare. Like, I think it's hard for me to tell. I've heard some rumors. I think what was going on in some of these cases, and what is going on as of yesterday at least, is VCs were coming in on a project like, let's say, Tezos, maybe even EOS, I don't know. And rather than buy shares of Tezos as a company, they would buy tokens in Tezos with the understanding that that mapped to some representative holding of the Tezos company, and that there was at some level an agreement between the principals and them to not issue shares in the company or to issue convertible shares that were convertible between the tokens and such. So effectively what was happening then in that arrangement is that the VCs are investing in a company that is, Ethereum 2.0, and the option that they have is to liquidate their position before they would otherwise be able to in a regulatory environment, because they would liquidate it through quote unquote tokens as opposed to shares. And now that we have progressed, I don't know what will happen in those schemes, but my suspicion is that they will be either significantly reduced in their scale, or like Marco Santori or one of these guys will come up with some defense that'll get tested in court and will actually pass the muster, which I highly doubt, but it is possible. And what they'll end up doing is some convoluted scheme where you have, like in-game tokens of a kind that go through some intermediary layer of conversion between tokens and representation of the stock or something like that. I don't know. It would get really complicated, though. I think that what would happen is a lot of people would get spooked at this point, and probably the other thing too, you got to realize a lot of these guys, like Tim Draper's got a lot of money. He doesn't need the risk exposure of an SEC case and the cost associated with it if he could invest in something else. So just because it seems like a hot product to the listeners of this show and maybe yourself, it doesn't mean that it is a hot product to Tim Draper. It was a hot product when there was zero liability. But when now there's a chance that he could go to jail, all of a sudden, it costs him more money to go to jail than it costs you and I to go to jail for some very basic reasons. Chiefly that our time is spent doing normal menial things. His time is spent doing whatever the hell he wants. So going to jail is a bigger restriction in his lifestyle than it is for ours. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's a stretch, but that's kind of what it seems like to me.
What about let's talk specifically about Ethereum, because obviously I think that's a total security, the way it was set up, pre-sale, the pre-mine, and everything, the way it was done. What does that mean for Vitalik with this ruling? Does he get go to jail, or does he get a pass? Like, what's going to happen to him?
Well, as I understand the ruling, and certainly as I would even advocate it based on what I'd like to see, I don't think that he should go to jail. And as it stands now, I think Vitalik has immunity. Now, what he does from here might be suspect. He put his name on a lot of projects for a while. And it seems like he stopped doing that, and that was smart. But if he put his name on projects going forward, he would be a very high-profile case for them to prosecute because his name was on stuff in the past. So the sort of unrepentant scammer type is, in high-profile one at that, is generally a juicy target for these types of high-profile cases. So if he were wise, he would curb all of his investment activity at this point on. And I would probably suggest to him, he needs to speak to an attorney, but don't sell your ether. Just sit on it or write it off. Hopefully you sold enough Vitalik to where you've been made more than whole and you don't get greedy. If he sells his ether, he still may not have any additional exposure. But what I will say, and I tweeted this, and I don't exactly know what the answer is, but we have to decide with ether, is the ether that's been generated with proof of work, are those not securities, those ether, whereas the ones that were generated in the crowd sale are ether? Because it would seem to me that the provenance of ether does have bearing. And I did a poll on Twitter, and it seems that most people agree that there are effectively two classes of shares in Ethereum: the shares from the ICO and the shares from proof of work. So it's possible that anything that he's got from proof of work would be, exempt from any of these concerns, whereas the ones he had from the ICO wouldn't be. But these are nuanced details that probably need to be figured out in court at some point.
Excellent. Brian, do you have any questions regarding the SEC by any?
Well, I think Chris is right about one thing for sure. I don't think there are many real tough guys in the space, and they're going to roll over real quick. And he's right. We don't, as ordinary, average Joes, don't have anything to lose in comparison to the Tim Draper types going to jail. So it is going to change the way they go about their investments and their decisions. Absolutely. I spot on agree with what he said there.
Yeah, I mean, the average person, like for anyone listening to this, like you should ask yourself how much it's worth to go to jail. Like reputational damage aside, there's a very wise answer to that, and you have to decide what it is personally. It might be $100,000, $200,000, etc. In the case of something like Tim Draper, it's going to have to be like $1 billion a year, and he's not going to make $1 billion on ICOs, or if he is, in risk-adjusted terms, it would be crazy amounts of risk. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the ICO market is dead after this. It's got to be, because after you take away the heavy investors and all the VC investors, there's really no point in trying to raise money this way. You might as well just crowdfund in a different way. Just go ahead and just straight up ask for money on the street. Maybe you'll get more. But
so I have another SEC type question. So I've always thought that they want in to Bitcoin, but haven't found their opening. And if this might give them a little toehold into the door to where someday they might get their claws into Bitcoin.
I don't think that the SEC wants into Bitcoin as much as the DEA does. I think the DEA really wants into Bitcoin. I think the SEC finds Bitcoin nominally interesting compared to the DEA. So I don't know if those agencies collude. I don't know how that works. I would find that topic kind of interesting, because I could see the DEA putting pressure on exchanges and such through the SEC in some capacity if there was a collusion there. The SEC's attitude, I think, on Bitcoin is that it's a toy. I don't think that they see it in the way that like Bitcoiners do, where because like there's a handful of ways that you can really take down Bitcoin that it's really probably not that hard. And they've probably discussed this at some capacity. And I don't think that this angle would even be one of them. So I think for them, I also think too, like from a regulator standpoint, I think this is actually a really big problem that we have in Bitcoin. But the regulators have probably decided that blockchain technology is interesting, which I don't even actually believe myself, but they probably do. And so I would guess that they probably decided that in the case that blockchain technology is interesting, perhaps squashing these things isn't appropriate at this time. I think also they were probably open to retail payments becoming a more efficient operation as a result of this thing, which I don't believe will be the case. And so that's another reason why I think that they probably left this door slightly open. But if in fact those windows close where they've decided that no, there will be no application for payments, and no, there will be no application in business transaction processing or something like that, then we're in a really weird spot as Bitcoiners, because like the truth is that there's not a lot of good answers that you can give to a regulator as to why we need Bitcoin, and there's never been great ones, and the okay to good ones are becoming less and less likely. So now we have to go, so maybe not me, but somebody has to go in a suit and explain to Congress at some point, or a regulator or the Senate or whatever, these are the reasons why Americans need Bitcoin. And that's becoming a difficult conversation to have. So we need to pump maybe on, notarization version 3 or something to whet their appetite, maybe.
Okay, Chris, I know someone in the audience mentioned if the ICOs are, I said the ICOs are dead, and he mentioned it was Richard Hart. Thank you for watching, Richard. I love your comments. And why isn't Ethereum plunging to zero after the SEC? That's the main instrument that's being used to pump these ICOs. Do you think these ICO people they're in disbelief? They're in denial in some ways, because after all, they're involved in it, so they have the incentive to totally just ignore what's kind of come to light. The news of the SEC letter.
Yeah, there's no faith in these things. Now, it's too soon to say that Ethereum won't plummet, because there's a bit of time, I think, needed for some of the whales to process things, and I would expect that they will start liquidating slowly. And if you look at a lot of these coins, generally what you find is that the explosions are fairly rare. They're usually like tapered out and drawn out as people lose faith after a day or two. Like like this will come out and someone will hear it, or maybe some news agency will say something, or et cetera, et cetera. And so they usually just do kind of taper out. But there's also like a very serious faith there that I think a lot of people are kind of married to, not only in terms of like their own psyche, but like they have to talk to their wives or their business partners or things like that, where they believed that Ethereum was a world computer more so than anything else, and the ICOs were vindicating the former theory. But even without the ICOs, I would say they are anchored to this for these various reasons, and they haven't sat down to the math, and they can't do the math. They don't understand the proposition. So for them, they may feel that, well, okay, fine, ICOs were just a recent thing anyways, back to processing the futurology government and the self-driving cars, et cetera, then, because that's how they understand the problem. But I would expect that this would probably be like a fairly significant maxima for Ethereum, and it would be slightly tapering down from here.
Okay. Well, we're going to leave the subject of Ethereum and the SEC, and I wanted to talk about AlphaBay, because in one of your shows you had a guest on, and she's a writer or a reporter.
Yeah,
she was going to write a book.
Yeah, Ormsby. She's written a book. It's very good.
And in the interview, she mentioned how she felt AlphaBay, or she said AlphaBay was run by the Russians. Now that Alexander Kraz, who is a Canadian, there seems to be no Russian mafia connection to this whole thing. So do you think she's just full of shit trying to sell her book, or what's going on with that? Because what she said and what's kind of come to light doesn't seem to match up.
I was doing a lot of investigative work around AlphaBay. This was during my trip to Thailand, most of which I cannot talk about and have not talked about. And I kept finding Russian people at every turn, which was very hard for me to do a really thorough investigation, quite frankly. Because
there's a lot of Russian people in Florida too, but does that mean there's Russian mafias in Florida?
There's a lot of Russians in Thailand. If you've ever been to Pattaya, particularly, like it is like so Russian. And because like Thailand is like a playground for Russians. So for me, when I saw it was first off, I was in Thailand for reasons related to, in part at least, some of this. So I didn't necessarily actually see that as being exclusive of a Russian connection. And I know for certain that a number of the mods were Russian. There was a huge foreign language, there's a Russian language section on their website, and a lot of the vendors and such. Also, I think with the BTC-e stuff coming out now, it's looking like a lot of Russians were mixing coins through BTC-e. Now, the thing about Russia is, like, especially for me as a American, it's hard for me to separate the Russian country with the former Russian countries. So, I think in many ways, a lot of these people are from former USSR countries, such as Ukraine. And I think that there's a lot of the hacker types as well that are in that field that I think perturb sort of the drug line. So, like, the degree to which you're a drug dealer or you are a carder, like, it certainly matters, but they cross paths enough to where, like, AlphaBay mods and such probably have exposure to both communities in some capacity. So yeah, I don't. It was unusual to me that it would be a de facto Canadian guy, but when I hear these in Thailand, a big part of me is like, well, why else would he be in Thailand if not because it's better than Russia and he needs to communicate with Russians? So I wouldn't be surprised. I think there's a consensus view that a lot of the people on that site were Russian. So if it wasn't run by the Russian mafia, what's very likely nonetheless is that there's a significant Russian organized crime element that's going through multiple darknet markets. That would probably be my takeaway. We'll see. I would say it's too quick to judge. Like, wait till the fallout happens before we have any conclusions there. Because I'm very sympathetic to her opinion.
Now, when you were in Thailand, did you have a chance to meet Alexander Kraz while you were there?
Not him. No, I did not know about him. I wish I did. I absolutely would have dropped everything I was doing to get to know that guy. I did spend a few days at the Bangkok Remand with Mongoose. Mongoose was a very instrumental person at Silk Road, and the allegation is that he is Variety Jones. It is an allegation that has not been tested in court yet because he is fighting extradition there in Thailand. So I visited him at the Maximum Security Center there in Bangkok, and you only get like 20 minutes at a time with him. So I was in Bangkok for a while. So for a few days, I would go over, sequentially and spend time with him. And he was a really interesting guy. Liked that guy a lot. So that was similar. We'll see if he ends up in the news. Hopefully not. Hopefully he beats his extradition.
And then we talk about the suicide of Alexander Kraz. How real is that? I mean, do you think he killed himself, or was he offed by the Russians, as people would probably suspect or think?
Yeah, I would bet that he killed himself, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was the rest of the story. I mean, and that's what tough guys do, and that's how tough guys play games. So when I look at the ICO crowd and then I look at the AlphaBay crowd, the hanging in a jail cell is a significantly more likely case of silencing somebody than it would be for any ICO type of market. And yeah, it's a conspiracy theory. You can't disprove it, but that kind of stuff happens all the time over there. It's not uncommon at all.
Okay,
it's another world. I had a bunch of Russians with guys there that were tangentially related to the darknet markets, and they were tough guys. And actually, they were mostly Russian. So there's the Bitcoin. People don't quite realize that where we're at, I think, at the crossroads of Bitcoin. And I put myself in the middle of this stuff. Like I'm finishing up this Weave interview. That's also kind of an instrumental thing for me. I don't know if that'll be popular with people, but it's an important thing to listen to, I think, because like Bitcoin tends to hang out in bad spots and bad places. And I hate to characterize commerce as bad, and I hate to characterize Bitcoin as bad, but the degree to which things grow in our society is very often controlled by the amount of money that is afforded. And while there's a lot of injustices that are definitely committed as a result of restricting liquidity to markets, there's also a lot of greater good that is achieved. And I think in the case of the darknet markets, we're all very sympathetic to the liquidity brought in there for various reasons, some of which may actually be bad, but some of which are very good for historical purposes. But then you look at a guy like Weave, and I don't know that what he's doing is so nice. He's effectively, Weave is really interesting. He's a very complex person. He is a CTO for the Daily Stormer. If you haven't seen the Daily Stormer, you probably should. It's an anti-Semitic, bigoted website, but it spreads these messages in a way that's absolutely hilarious. Funny. I see the humor in it. Not everybody does, but I definitely see the humor in it. And it's a site that is you think is parody at first, because you look at it and you're like, well, no one believes this. Also, that's hilarious. And then you realize that no, actually, these people do believe it, and they're using comedy to get people in the door to subject them to what is effectively propaganda, and even like Nazi propaganda. And while that kind of stuff has always happened in the past, you now have a source of funding by which members and people sympathetic to these goals are able to grow the operation. And that's what we're seeing, is it's entirely supported by Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So that needs to be dealt with by Bitcoiners at some level eventually. I don't know how we got onto that exactly, but these things are out there.
Okay, and then with the shuttering of AlphaBay and also Hesana, which seems to be very interesting, that the story I read is Hansa. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's Hansa.
You could tell I don't go on the dark markets at all, but I do trade Bitcoin peer to peer, and I do have to admit there is a dark side to Bitcoin, not only in just the trading of it, because you meet quite a bit of questionable people, but also just where Bitcoin has led me to believe. It's taken me all over the place. It's also taken me into Canada. I also trade there as well. And so I do think that Bitcoin is used for illicit purposes, not because it's their first choice. It's probably because it's probably one of their only choices, because all the other options are very, very restrictive, because the way the system works, it's centralized, so they're just cut off. And so they're just going to a Bitcoin because somehow Bitcoin has made its way as a preferred currency in that particular instance for the dark markets. It seems to transfer value and you can just do it. You may have to pay premium to get those Bitcoins, but considering the fact that you can't even send money at all, either Western Union, Bankwire, or whatever other means, it seems to just work its way towards that niche. But what I want to know is, now that, what was that? How do you say that German dark market? What was it?
Hansa.
Hansa. Okay, so AlphaBay and Hansa are effectively shuttered. They're down. Now that leaves a pretty big void, and it seems to be a vacuum now, because after AlphaBay went down, Hansa, everyone just rushed to Hansa, only to be, I guess, entrapped, because apparently it was already overtaken by the FBI at that time.
Right.
And so what does that mean for the users? Because I don't think this stuff is going to go away. A lot of people depended on making a living or having a life, either buying these drugs, probably reselling them, and also carding. Carding, I think, basically stolen credit card information. It's probably one of the bigger markets for this, because it was probably the easiest. You send your Bitcoin, you get what they call a dump, effectively, and then they're just making cards and then using them. So what's gonna fill that vacuum? Because obviously there's a huge demand now. There's got to be a huge demand now.
Yeah, well, what happens when the enforcement efforts step up is the market starts to splinter. So, like, liquidity, it reduces roughly in some components of scene, and what you'll find is that there's multiple people at a lesser level. So, like, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered, and what we saw here was that the hogs were getting slaughtered. But now there's tons of pigs out there. I mean, like, just looking at there's just so many. I mean, here I'll read off a few: Majestic Gardens, CGMC, Dream Market, Valhalla, the Trade Route, Wall Street Market. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And some of these are actually extremely good. I mean, better than Hansa and AlphaBay. Like, Darknet Heroes League is one of the best markets from what I'm told, and it's one of the best markets because it's invite only, and it's not easy to get an invite, and once you do, you're in a pretty upper tier. So I think what will happen is that these guys will stop trying to take over the world and try to be local maximas, and they'll probably even specialize too, which has been kind of the case for a while. Some of these places will specialize in, like, club drugs, some will specialize in guns, and I think that's what we'll see there. I actually did an interview with a guy who's pretty well connected in the community. It's frustrating because I can't really air that. That's on my Patreon, or will be on my Patreon. I haven't released it. It'll be Patreon-only content. It's like a good 2 hours, I think, an hour and a half of discussion with him about the state of the markets right now. And there's, one of the things that he and I were talking about is that there's effectively like two classes of darknet market or drug darknet market users. There are effectively the kids, who are young adults and teenagers who want to experiment. They have zero relationships with people locally, but they want something slightly exotic. So they go in the darknet market. But the volume on those orders is very small, and there's a lot of risk to it. So that's not generally like the best way to get customers, but like when you're starting out in the business as a vendor, that's where you need to go. But then there's the guys that you really want, the guys who are selling at clubs, or they're selling at festivals, or they're selling like fentanyl on the streets maybe. And those guys are going to be like great customers because they represent relatively low risk. There's no customer acquisition costs, and it's based off of entrenched demand and supply needs. So those guys are completely unaffected by any of this stuff because those trade routes will exist and will solidify independent of the markets. And that might very well represent a majority even of the darknet volume. It's hard to say because nobody has these numbers. And so those guys will continue. One of the ways I think you can test that theory easily is to see how fentanyl on the streets reacts as a result of these shutdowns. And my suspicion is that it won't. Now, fentanyl is a little bit complicated because that has started to be manufactured like in Mexico, and it moves over the border along with all other drugs. But you can get a rough idea, I think. Or like carfentanil maybe, or like pink, or one of these other new ones. Like if the market wasn't bifurcated in such a capacity, then you would expect to see the volume on the streets go down. And my suspicion is that it just won't be impacted whatsoever.
Okay, so the street drugs are still there, but just not impacted. Was that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, you have this. The thing is that like there's kind of like two classifications of drugs. There's like party drugs, and there's like disease drugs. And it's nobody really has a casual heroin use. Like it's generally like a pretty sad story. I've hung out with a few of these guys, and even for the show over the years, we kind of find these guys, we ask them questions, we brought you in the studio and such. Now there's definitely some exceptions. I had a guy, Baked Pasta Party, who seemed to be an exception on the show. You can find him in the SoundCloud. Yeah, I mean, those aren't really kid drugs. There's like you're on a spectrum at that point to where like you either are going to have to quit doing drugs or you are going to be a street junkie generally. Crack is like that. Methamphetamine's kind of like that. Like I get that that's not always the case. So that's one class, and then the other class is like acid, which is basically harmless. Mushrooms, ecstasy, same kind of thing. 2CB, 2CI, they're just not going to hurt you. And you can do them at a festival and have good fun with your friends, and it's just like a cool weekend.
What's your favorite drug, Chris? I know you tell
Heroin's,
people all the time.
Heroin's my favorite drug. I tell people all the time.
So where do you get your heroin? Do you go on the dark net or do you go to your local dealer?
I mean, the honest truth is I don't do heroin. And I have tried it before, and I've tried all drugs. I don't have a habit. In fact, I even recently quit drinking entirely. We'll see if I pick it up. I smoke weed on occasion, and I smoke cigars. When I'm able to, I do smoke opium. Opium's great, but it's kind of hard to get in America. And frankly, I don't even want to get in America because like there's no like frequency of opium smoking that's particularly appropriate, probably. But if you're like hanging out in communist Laos and somebody brings like an opium pipe over, like smoke some opium and you'll enjoy it. And so like that's basically my drug use. But as I get older, I try to curb my sort of compulsive behaviors, and I try to maximize my best thinking time. So I'm actually a pretty boring guy by and large, but I'm a boring guy who like has been through a lot and who doesn't have any qualms about like talking about it. I don't have like any shame about these things.
And another thing is, and I'm gonna start conversing with you a little bit, unless Brian has any questions or want to chime in on anything. Is it true that you're a sex offender?
Oh, people like that. So one of the things I do, like I throw these things out. There's a couple of reasons I do it. People like to, people like to evaluate people, not ideas. And one of the problems we have in this space, and it's in a lot of places, but definitely in this space, is the oracleization of people. People like come to the space looking for hidden truths. What will the price be? What is any number of questions? Things that the universe doesn't have answers to. And charlatans come out of the woodwork with, purported answer. And those charlatans always have the best credentials. They're well dressed and they're kind, and they've done great deeds. And for me, I think that one of the struggles I realized early on is that in order to actually have a responsible opinion in this space, you can't believe in oracles, because the oracles will completely detract from the conversation, because like they're untestable claims and they're non sequiturs. And if you're going to believe in that, then I just can't have any kind of functional conversation with you, because you won't evaluate ideas. So the way to win that sort of like that tactic or that threat or that antagonist is to lose. Like you just say like, yeah, I'm a registered sex offender, and I do heroin and a bunch of other stuff I've said that's outlandish. And when you do those things, like people then have to say like, well, but he wasn't wrong about this, and well, he's kind of seems like he knows more about that. And then before you know it, people start evaluating ideas and they stop evaluating people. And so I think as a rhetorical tool, it's very useful. And then the other thing too, I think, is you got to kind of like show some humility, which people don't think I have humility ever, which is maybe it's true, but like in at least in the conversation, you have to introduce some humility, so that like I think the interface has been defined that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to be a bad person. Let's just try to work through what we can learn here. And so to the degree that I'm a sex offender is a very shallow degree. Incidentally, when I was like 23, I was at the water park with my family, and I was drinking. I was very drunk, and I was running around with a Cheeto in front of my pants and pretending like it was a penis. And a young girl had seen it, and she told security that there was a man with his penis out, and security came and arrested me. That was the time that I was arrested. I spent the night in jail for what at the time was like an indecent exposure thing. But at my first hearing, got reduced to disorderly conduct. The park claimed it had on video. There was no such video. And the girl's testimony, the girl was she was a young girl. She just learned in school, I think, that you got to watch out for these things. And there were no other witnesses, and the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. So that might actually be where the origin of that story came from, but I kind of embraced and extended it, again, for the rhetorical purposes.
All right. So you are not a sex offender, or are you? Like, do you have to you have to like go to Miami and say, hey, I'm here to report I'm a sex offender. Are you or are you not? So.
No, I'm not. I mean, you can look me up on databases. You'll be very disappointed. There's no such record of me as a sex offender.
I was hoping you would be. You know, I was really looking forward to that.
It's not set in stone. I can become a registered sex offender at any time. So who knows? Maybe I will.
Go date an underage girl and perhaps have sex with her, so you can live up to that legend.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
The James Bond Bitcoin Live show, nor its producers or any of its guests condone any type of malfeasance, sexual assault, murder, or any criminal activity whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for that. Brian, that's why Brian's here, because sometimes I tell people that I would kill somebody or murder someone, or someone should be murdered. So Brian's there to make sure that there's a disclosure. So thank you, Brian. Now,
thank you, Brian.
You know, there was one more thing on the dark markets before we move on to another subject. There were supposedly like hit sites, like murder for hire sites. Now, supposedly those are just scams, and all they do is just take your money. And I've seen reports where there were people who were trying to put a hit on his wife. I think it was a report that this guy was going to put a hit on his wife. Apparently, the way the police found it was someone leaked that information to the authorities somehow. And there's sites that will take your money but won't do anything. How long before you think it actually becomes real?
So yeah, I think you're describing Besa Mafia, BESA Mafia, and that's a weird story. In fact, I think that's Elaine's next book is going to be on Besa Mafia. So there's a number of hitmen for hire services online, and there's been a number of what are they called? Assassination markets online that have all been scams. Every single one of them, start to finish. If you go online to kill somebody, you will have your money taken from you, and that person will not die. I don't know how that market works, but there's just no incentive for the person to make do. You don't have repeat customers in the killing game, or if you do, then you have a relationship with a primary source, such as the Russian mafia or the Colombian cartel, and you work for them exclusively. And there's so much risk in finding new customers that the only appropriate thing to do is to take the money and run when somebody offers it to you. So don't go online to have somebody killed. Don't have people killed in general, probably is good advice.
This sounds like a good case study for Ethereum contracts.
Maybe. The problem is you've got to figure out who the Oracle. The Oracle is always the Achilles heel. It just kicks the can down the road to the next gigantic problem. So smart contracts are a very dubious proposition to me.
All right. So let me get on to the next question here. I wanted to talk about Junseth and what happened, because when I was watching you guys, you were very funny. I was laughing at all your videos. I thought it was hilarious. And then all of a sudden there was this huge break, and I'm going, well, what's going on? Maybe it's just summer vacation, but apparently it was more than that. Could you elaborate into that?
Sure. So, I mean, a couple of things happened around the same time. I left the country for a bit. I was out touring, and Junseth stayed behind, and we were making the shows kind of work. But Junseth wasn't really kind of into the show as much anymore. He may or may not say that now. I don't know, but I mean, it was kind of the case. The Scammies was way behind schedule. He wasn't, doing some stuff on his end that I think were needed. And I was doing this trip where I was supposed to be doing some programming, and I wanted to lean on him a little bit, and he really was kind of exiting. And he made it clear to me that he wanted to leave the show as well. Now, from there, and that was fine enough because we didn't really set a date or anything like that. But I think what ended up happening is he was enticed. So what ended up happening then, it came to a point when he found, quote unquote, found a bunch of Peppy cash that was given to him. And he had pumped this on the show. and then dumped it. And that was very much against, I think, a lot of the core beliefs that we had on the show. I always had a set of rules that we worked by, and I think, and the fans agreed. Like, I had a ton of people write in telling me that this was a complete conflict of interest, that this was antithetical to the purpose of the show, and I agreed. And I think what happened really is that Junseth was kind of like had a foot out the door, and his heart wasn't in it, and he had the opportunity to take some easy money, and he took it. And I was very disappointed by that. And then the communications just broke down from there. I was very okay to either give him the show or to continue it in some capacity, but I didn't think that we could do it in all legitimacy, like nothing had happened. And I don't think Junseth, I think at that point, Junseth just didn't really want to do anything. I think either he wanted me to join the conspiracy or a conspiracy to smooth it over, which I was not willing to do, or I think he just didn't care enough about the issue. But Junseth stopped talking to me, and so he wouldn't answer his texts or anything, his messages, calls, nothing, which I was very disappointed by.
The money, was it about the money? You think it corrupted him?
I don't want to go into too much stuff, but he had some personal stuff going on, I think, at the time too. And it was just a few things adding up, and then I think that his commitment level was low as a result of it. And I do feel bad. I feel genuinely bad, because I would have liked to have helped him out with a lot of that stuff. But his solution was to just not talk about it, to the degree that he completely ignored me. I even came back early. This trip, I was supposed to be in this trip till basically like now. I would probably been traveling throughout Asia. And I cut it short, thinking that I could talk to him in person, and he didn't answer his phone call. And when I was in town, and it was just as well. I had other stuff to do here, anyways. And so, that was basically the end of that. And I was very disappointed by the way that went down. And we haven't talked to this day. So it's unfortunate. I wish there was an easier way to tell that story, or a nicer way to tell it. But that's the way I see it. And he's since started Junseth's World, and it seems like it's a fine enough show. And I listened to a good bit of it. You can tell where the Junseth influence or the Chris influence for Bitcoin Uncensored is. And for some people, Junseth's World is everything that they wanted in Bitcoin Uncensored without the Chris DeRose, so it's perfect. And then for some people, Bitcoin Uncensored or Chris DeRose Uncensored is everything that they wanted without the Junseth. And so I certainly wish him best of luck with the show. I suspect what will happen is he's got like Dante and Sean editing it, and for as long as they edit it, he'll probably do it. And then my suspicion is that once they stop, he'll stop. But who knows? I would wish him the most success in the world with that, if that's what he wants to do.
Yeah, I've had a chance to listen to Junseth, and I have to admit his shows are long, and they talk a lot, and he laughs a lot too. It's not quite the same. I do have to admit, without you and him together, it seemed like you were a great pair. It's a shame that you guys aren't together, because I did enjoy your show. But I do still watch you, Chris, because I do think you offer some information and something to learn from, because you offer more into the space where I think Junseth just likes to make a lot of jokes and laugh,
Right.
Which is a little different.
Yeah, it was a good pair. It was a very, very good pair. I agree. I don't know. We'll see how things go. Like, I've got some ideas for the show going forward. I really like making content, and there's a few problems we had with the show. Another thing too, I have to say, I wanted to grow the show, and Junseth didn't want to grow the show. And it's funny to me, because there's a lot of people who blame me for wanting to grow the show, which I thought was kind of a weird accusation at the start. I still don't. I get it, but it's kind of a weird accusation. I think that was also one of Junseth's apprehensions, is that he was happy with it being a long show where he kind of jokes around, and which I enjoyed. I think everybody enjoyed that listened, and that was that. And then I think for me, I was like, well, I want to take this to the next level, and so I do shorter shows. I'm trying to do shorter still. In fact, what I think my new format will be is I'm in part because I have to, frankly. I'm taking bits and pieces of my shows and putting on YouTube and editing them fairly well, in the interest of getting people kind of into what my ethos is and what I like to talk about. And then from there, if they want to hear the full content, they have to be a Patreon member, which I'd even like to put some of this stuff elsewhere, but SoundCloud is shutting down. And paying for the content really helps the show, helps me grow it. I may in fact explore a format, if money comes in, I guess, at some level, where I have a comedian on the show to do stuff with us. But the other side of it is that a lot of the stuff that I want to explore is like too hot for YouTube, and I've had some videos censored, and particularly lately, and so it's hard for me to grow a show any other way, which is good. I mean, like, I think that that's one of the things people like, is that I go into these like dark places and I get out the information that they're not hearing anyplace else. But because of that, it runs afoul of the censorship police too sometimes. So I think I've got the best of both worlds for as long as I can last on Patreon, and then from there, who knows? I'm talking to other people about alternate ways of running it if I get censored there. I have a knack for that.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad you had a chance to answer all those questions. And the last subject I guess we'll talk about, which has happened today, was another Alexander. Alexander, I don't know how to say his last name, Vitalik. Almost sounds like Vitalik almost. A lot of Alexanders. If your name is Alexander and you're in the dark market, you're probably going to be arrested. But he's the owner of BTC-e, which that's where I traded on for the first time to get my Bitcoin. It turns out that I don't know if he's responsible. Supposedly he's responsible for hacking Mt. Gox and also laundering a lot of money, like the ransomware money, maybe even some of the money that came from the dark markets, because it was like nobody knew who owned it. And if you weren't a U.S. citizen or in the U.S., you were able to receive some fiat currency somehow. What are your thoughts on that, and how is that going to affect the overall both dark markets and the regular markets?
So I was spending a little bit of time, short amount of time, with Mark Karpelès when I was in Japan, and he didn't leak any information, and he's a hard guy to read. But I had to say, at the time, my comprehension was such that he knew who hacked him, and he didn't share that information with me, and he kept that very confidential, to his credit. But this news, I guess, it is surprising in a lot of ways, but it isn't completely surprising to me, because I guess I had that exchange with Mark, and I did walk away with that impression that Mark was, but I thought it was going to be like Jed McCaleb, is what I thought. And who knows? This hasn't developed. It wouldn't surprise me. Like, I think there's the official story is that like the wallet.dat file was compromised, but like Mark isn't stupid. Like Mark is a strange guy. He would definitely appear to somebody as the kind of guy who is a bit on the maybe autism spectrum, or like Asperger's or something. He gets into things. He seems exceptionally smart, actually. He has like a weirdly good memory. There's some like numbers and stuff that he kind of was able to throw out of his head, and maybe they were parlor tricks, but I don't think so. When I was hanging out with him, he taught himself Japanese on his own at a young age as a French man. He taught himself English as well, and he does not have any formal schooling. In fact, his schooling was very much like mine and a number of other people other than the space where like we just were bad students. And I think that the Mt. Gox story is very unfair to Mark based on what I talked to him about and what I'm seeing. I think that Mark was hacked after he took over Mt. Gox, like I think a month or something. It was a very short period of time, and Mark was effectively given Mt. Gox by Jed McCaleb, and Jed McCaleb's kind of a scammer in other ways, Ripple and some other things. And I think what happened is Jed McCaleb knew that he had a hot potato, and either it wouldn't surprise me if he knew he was compromised, or if like he was already compromised or something. He gave the liability to Mark. Mark didn't pay for Mt. Gox, or he paid some nominal amount of money, and then he did like a profit sharing thing. In fact, if I remember right, the story is that Mark Karpelès wrote a Bitcoin price ticker widget for something like a PHP, WordPress plugin or something, and he had in doing so started a communication with Jed. And then like Jed just like kind of proposed one day, like, hey, would you want to take over this? And then Mark was like, sure. And then like a month later, it was like hacked, and he was like the worst person in the world. Which is actually very funny. It's like a very Bitcoin story. So I guess I think a lot of the stuff that happened at Mt. Gox is going to be very revealing, because Mark has a pretty good, to his own demise, he's got a pretty good handle on keeping information secret. So I think a lot of the story has been told by other people, and none of the story has been told by Mark. And I think as we start to hear more and more of the story from Mark, it's going to make a lot more sense. And this is the kind of stuff that we're going to see. I think Jed's going to have some very interesting inconvenient truths to deal with too. As far as Alex is concerned, I'm trying to find. I know that I talked to him at some point a long time ago, and I remember. I'm pretty sure it was him. If not, it was somebody there at BTC-e, but I'm pretty sure it was him. And I emailed him and like, why don't you come on the show? And he's like, no. And he's like, okay, but just answer me this: why are your prices so much lower than Bitstamp and everybody else at the time? And he had a one-word response, and the response was markets, and that was the extent of our communication. And I'm trying to find it now because it seems relevant. Because at the time I was reading, I think we even talked about it in Bitcoin Uncensored. I was reading between the lines on that, and I was like, well, you know, he's definitely running something untoward, and he needs to get rid of that supply, and there's more risk on that supply. I mean, that was the meaning as I interpreted it, which it would be, I think, what his insinuation was, you know, without any culpability and admission. So now that this happened, I think as well, I'm pretty sure it was him. I gotta really find it. That would be nice to find. I can at least point to that as like a hint, you know, that I received and maybe didn't put together with Mt. Gox, but was at least historically interesting.
So I'm sorry to break in, but basically he was insinuating that he had more supply of Bitcoins, and that's why his exchange was lower in price to get people to buy them. Is that the premise?
I think it would be a combination of more supply and a riskier product. He's been offering a riskier product for years. His Bitcoin are riskier than Coinbase's Bitcoin. Therefore, there would be a price reduction.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing too that's interesting here is like, okay, so like BTC is down right now, and I don't know. Is there like an official answer as to why BTC is down? They say it's maintenance, but like I don't believe that.
I don't know if you heard the news today, but apparently that Alex has been arrested in Greece.
Oh no, I heard that.
Okay.
I heard that. So then why is the site down? Is the site down because like he needs to hit like a button over there? Because I know he has other people working there.
Well, okay. So why is the exchange down?
Yeah.
I would assume that everyone's scrambling. This may be the exit scam. Last I heard, the cold wallet was being moved. So my thinking is they have a fear that they're going to have their Bitcoin seized. So whoever else is the owners or investors are trying to scramble and figure out what to do with their Bitcoin.
So I mean that's the big question then is how many Bitcoin do they have? I think I heard from somebody they have like 60,000 Bitcoin or something. Is that sound about right to you?
Yeah, the cold wallet had something like 60,000 Bitcoins, and then of course the Ethereum, the Litecoin, and all this other stuff. So and whatever cash they have in whatever bank.
So I think their latest tweet was 6 hours ago, and that tweet says, "At the moment, work is underway to restore service. Approximate terms from 5 to 10 days. Thank you for understanding." Now, I don't believe that. It would be astonishing if that were true. That was in Russian too, by the way. So I translated it. Maybe there's a translation something interesting in the translation that's not going through Google. But so what's going to happen now when BTC-e turns on? Because either that inventory is going to be available and there'll be a run on the bank, and that's going to be very interesting. A lot of those people are going to be hopefully not cashing out to dollars, but very many of them probably are going to cash out to dollars. BTC-e was a big money laundering source. I mean, it just was. And to the degree that like AlphaBay was or wasn't a Russian operation, well, BTC-e seems to be. And I think that that means that there's going to be a void in the market now for a loss of volume and liquidity for that side of the market. So that should represent greater risk in Bitcoin. That should represent greater desperation to people who want to cash out, and a growing recognition of the difficulties in cashing out. So I would think that there would be a corresponding reduction in the price contingent upon that. But it's Bitcoin. You never know. Like it could be that like I don't know, the UHF date comes and some news related to that supersedes these concerns. But there is a substantial amount of Bitcoin right now without a home. It needs to find a home, and that is risk.
Well, another thing I've noticed in the past few months, especially since the beginning of this year, has been the local Bitcoins. I've noticed the Bitcoin to ruble has overtaken Bitcoin to US dollar in volume. So there may be some kind of Russian connection. It seems like everything these days there's a Russian connection, but you can't deny the fact that the volume on local Bitcoin to the ruble has increased, and I don't know if it's Russian mafia, maybe, but I think there's a combination. Maybe perhaps you may be right that there's a lot of people in the former Soviet Union who, unfortunately, their the economy is not doing so well, and some of those countries are very tech educated, and it seems like maybe it's just a combination of hackers just taking on an opportunity to make some money to provide for themselves in an otherwise situation where there's no tech jobs, there's no Google, there's no opportunity there for their skills. So this could be a reason, which I suspect, because there's a lot of things going on in that region that would indicate that they may not be Russian quote unquote mafia, but they're more like hackers getting together, and maybe they took this service to a Russian mafia, but I don't know if I could say that Russian mafias are like deep into this, because I don't think they're it doesn't seem like mobsters are computer nerds. They just they're more like pump and dump, boiler room pump and dump, but to hack a bank or hack exchanges and then dump the money. Maybe the money side could be on the.
That's changing. It's really changing fast. People don't realize this yet, and I see this on my end, but the Wild West is the internet, and there was a time when the robbing of banks and drugs and these things were like the big frontiers, and now the big frontier is online. I think the drug markets are pretty stabilized. I think that it's hard for a new gangster or mobster or element to really make a lot of headway there. But when it comes to like theft, the only place that you can make a name for yourself and have any degree of success is going to be online, and you can see it happening. The thefts are fairly brazen. I mean, you even saw I think the Bank of India was robbed by way of a Federal Reserve Bank in like New York a year ago, and those guys that they should make a movie about that heist, because that was an incredible heist. It seemed to end with a bunch of them liquidating the position at a poker table in I forgot what casino, but it's like right out of Ocean's 11. It's somewhere in the South Pacific, and there's a few of these things that are happening online that are, to me, indicative, I think, of the future. I think particularly in the sense that like ransomware, for example, that's another one that I think they have these communities. I get bits and pieces of this, and I always try to dig, and it's very hard. They have these communities where like you're in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood may be the capital city of Ukraine. Maybe it's Kiev. I don't know how you pronounce it. And like they're the white collar guys, and then there's like the sort of downtrodden, and those people, they have friends they went to high school with, and they had like uncles that were like made guys of a different generation, and they aspired to be like them. And before you know it, those guys are showing up with like all these girls and nice cars and stuff, and people start asking questions, and their answer is going to be online. And then that perpetuates, and before you know it, you've got like a gang, or you've got like a little syndicate, or you've got the uncle coming around with his friends who want to invest in these schemes. And I think that's what's going on in these places right now. I really do.
So the nerds are the new mafia leaders of the future, and the bank robbers.
The sophistication isn't as hard as you think. Like a lot of these like O-Days, the guys that are really good, the guys that are really, really good, they don't take the risk. And it seems to me that you have a lot of very precocious kids in some of these countries that are underutilized and that are coming up with these like vulnerabilities, and they sell them for nominal amounts of money, which is probably a lot to them. They're like 20 years old, and somebody offers them $50,000, and that's a great score. And then that guy takes that and starts a ransomware operation and makes $500,000. So like the sophistication required in the latter part is much lower. The risk is much greater. And if he's a tough guy, like that's really the specialization at that point, because now you've got $500,000, but like the US is coming around, looking into stuff. So you got to have a connection at the local police force, and that requires a little bit of greasing, a little bit of muscle. And that's not a skill that the first guy had. I think that's how that works. I think that's what I see.
Okay. Brian, do you have any questions for Chris, or any comments?
One thing I will add, I'd say about the exchanges, and in particular local Bitcoin, I haven't checked the volumes recently. Like last I checked was maybe a month or two ago, and I usually check them every couple weeks. Last I checked, it was Russia, America, and China were like way above and beyond everybody else on there. Those are the three big countries, and I try to follow. There are corridors, and the big corridors are like, at least for the darknet, U.S. to Netherlands is one. That's the ecstasy trade. Another one is U.S. to China. That's the research chemical trade, which principally includes like flocka and fentanyl, and principally fentanyl. Yeah, I think that there's incidentals from there, but that means that like the Bitcoin has to go from here to there and back, and that it goes in a circle. And I try to figure out how that's happening. And I have a lot of people who do over-the-counter sales, and I have a lot of people who are local Bitcoin guys. And I get bits and pieces and stories and anecdotes, and I've got a rough idea how it works. But there are guys that specialize in every step of that way. There's there's like active money transmission guys that I know, and I don't want to blow their operation. But there's guys that move them from Central and South America over to the Japanese exchanges, and like that's all they do. And they'll do that until maybe they were going through BTC-e, and now they'll have to figure something else out. But it's fascinating stuff because as the time goes on, those people are better and better and offer better rates and become increasingly, pivotal, I think, in the formation of the specialization of labor in these countries, in these industries. So like I would expect what would happen eventually is that China would reform and we would see significantly less fentanyl coming out, and that operation will move into like Indonesia or something. And so the guys that specialize in those routes will start operating there. And I forgot how they got into things earlier, but I think people should probably think of the markets in these terms.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because during, I think it's 2013, when I was starting to trade peer-to-peer, I reached out to Karl Mark Force over LinkedIn. And I asked him at that time, does South America, Latin markets, is there a big potential for Bitcoin use? And, now that I look back, but his reply was that it's untapped. It's not being used.
Yeah.
And he specifically named the Caribbean as well. And it seems to me like at the time he said China, Europe, the focus is on China, Europe, and the US. And so, and as far as these people who are in the markets, I think some of them do use exchanges because they don't want the volatility and the risk of the price moving, because that's their money, that's their profit. But because of all the hacks and everything, the exchanges being hacked, like a lot of them lose money. Like all those people who had their coins on BTC, well, they just lost. Well, I don't know if they lost it, but it's it's not coming back. So, and the coins are being moved around, so they didn't own the private keys, so they just lost everything, I guess. So, unfortunately, it seems like the market may be forced, or these players may be forced to hold their Bitcoin and accept the fact they literally have to become investors. They're going to have to become players in this. And basically, that's how I came in as an investor. I wanted more Bitcoin. And so as the price went down, I'm buying them, but I'm selling them right away as fast as I can, because that's people would come to me in that kind of demand. I would just sell out. But I would go back, and by the time I went back, the prices gone down like maybe to $50 to $100. Well, now I got X amount of money because I sold at a premium. I get to buy back at a lower price. I just got more Bitcoin. And if these players would just simply follow like a dollar cost average, they would make out with more money, because if they did this since 2013, they would all probably be millionaires by now from the price going up. And so if they could somehow live off the Bitcoin, or maybe they would be very creative in their accounting and start businesses that accept Bitcoin or use Bitcoin for products, for goods and services. Potentially they could build an economy. And I would compare that to how, like, Miami a city that you're in, was built literally from the drug trade, from cocaine.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for cocaine, you know, Miami would not be what it is today. You wouldn't have all those skyscrapers and all those nice buildings and everything, and the amount of money that was put in there, it wouldn't be there. So you know, it's not a bad story after all. There's some good that comes out of it, although it may come from a source that we frown upon or look down. But in reality, there's money to be made, and where there's money to be made, there is economic activity eventually.
Well, you know, I hate to disappoint you, but I've done a lot of research on who is storing Bitcoin, and it's very inconclusive. I have more questions than answers, but I have found an astonishing number of people in the space on the darknet are in fact using Bitcoin for 72 hours at a time, and they don't actually believe. They see Bitcoin as something very similar to e-gold or something like that, wherein it's useful, but it is significantly more risky than dollars. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of these guys, they want dollars. They'd rather lose 6%.
Realize that.
Yeah,
I realize that, but they should realize the use of Bitcoin. Because if they did, literally, they would all be millionaires, billionaires by now. Okay, because even from the peak of 2013 at 1200. And they kept trading this, and they, you know, the thing is, they lost out. They sold their Bitcoin for fiat. They probably thought they were preserving their cash, but as the price went down and went back up, I mean, the price going back up, I don't see how that could have been them dumping their coins on the exchange. I mean, there's something else here that's brought this price back up. I'm not entirely sure what it is. Is it lost coins? Or is it VC investors? Are we at a point where Bitcoin's starting to really become more adopted, other than the dark markets? But if these people who are using this for illicit activity were just holding it, you know, and instead of using a third party like an exchange, they would literally be billionaires by now. I mean, for the amount of coins that were going through their hands, and they just kept it like gold, like real gold.
You take it for granted that they have the sophistication to protect their Bitcoin. And you shouldn't take that for granted, because that is one of the hardest things in the world. I've known a lot of guys in this space that are very competent, and they all have been targets. I've been a target. I got hacked at one point. I lost some phenomenal amount of money. It was in the same event that Tony Gallipi got hacked to the tune of $1 million+, probably worth like
was it a phishing
$10 million
scam?
now.
Can you explain how you got hacked or?
Yeah, so at the time I was writing, I don't know how much I can exactly say, but at the time I was writing for one of the journals in the space, or I was trying to write. I was actually trying to write for a new one of the journals in the space. And I got an email from the editor, and the email said, "Hey, Chris, all right, we're ready to start running you. Why don't you write this story up, and we'll put you out like on the front page." And I was like, "Whoa, my big break! I'm gonna be like on the front page." And it's always your greed that'll get you guys, like always the greed. And it was a well-written email. It wasn't. It didn't look like a phishing email, and it came from. I even checked the headers after. It came from the guy who it purported to be from. That person had gotten hacked, and so I clicked on the link to my Google Docs. Google Docs asked me to log in. At the time, I was in an airport. The link was with my assignment, and at the time, I was in the airport, and I was boarding a plane. So I was in a hurry, and I wasn't doing my best thinking. And I clicked on the link, and it was, to like, I don't know, docs.google, with a 1e.com or something. I forgot what it was, or maybe it was like a 3 O's or something. And I logged in there. I did not have two-factor authentication. I did have two-factor authentication, I think, at the time. And I went ahead and it did the two-factor authentication thing with me. And then it brought me to like some weird page, and then I was like, well, it was like a good-looking Google, this site's broken kind of thing right now. Check back in 5 minutes. And I was like, okay, whatever. And I got my plane, and then I think I heard from somebody, or I got an email that from the guy about it, and then I went through my emails real fast as soon as I landed, and sure enough, the guy had only taken like a small amount out of my hot wallet. It was blockchain.info at the time. It wasn't even my active hot wallet. It was one of my wallets. Blockchain.info at the time would email you your private keys. And so he looked for that email, grabbed it, and used that to drain my funds. So he made out with maybe $1,000 at the time. I don't know what that's now. 10,000 maybe. But in the scheme of things, it was a lot better than what Tony lost.
You're talking
so
about
okay with
BitPay?
that. Yeah.
Are you talking about BitPay, the whatever thousands and thousands of Bitcoin on a stupid phishing email?
Yeah, it was the same exact guy that was. It was me and there was like 7 other Bitcoiners. We're all in that. And yeah, he was one of those guys. And I didn't realize it was funny because like I didn't realize that he was hacked at the time. After it happened to me, I didn't know that he was one of those people. The Bitcoin bull was immediately afterwards, and Tony was in like a foul mood. He was not happy, and I didn't know why. And then I read the news later, like a month later, that he'd gotten hacked. The week before. So yeah, that was basically that story. And you know what? I have no resentment over that. I thank the hacker for that. He taught me a lesson, a good lesson. And amongst many lessons, even the best of it is that your greed blinds you. You will be blinded by greed. Your metacognition does not kick in, and it disables that function. You act impulsively, and in this case, I clicked a link and I I gave him my information. I was like, "Here you go, buddy," and he took it. And you know what? That was a good lesson for me to learn, and hopefully, when your audience doesn't have to learn the hard way, but that applies everywhere. Touching on like the greater issue though too about these dark net market guys, like their math is weirder than yours because like they're making easy money. Like I've known a few of these guys in my life, and some of these guys that like buy a Lamborghini, I think at some level they know that they have a tenuous grasp on money. Not always, but sometimes. Like this AlphaBay guy, he had like 3 cars or so. Like he knew he was flirting with the brink. And so when that's like your mentality, in many ways, like if you're married to the job, or you've resigned yourself to this lifestyle, or you're just like in the mania, like making money on Bitcoin is less interesting because that money doesn't come in for a couple years. You'd rather just like sell more drugs, and that's what he did, is my suspicion. Although he did hold some Bitcoin, so like he did that. But I think for a lot of the guys in the space, they just blow the money, and it's not even irrational for them to do, because given the risk of their job, if they are going to do it, they are going to get caught eventually. They might as well just enjoy it. There's really no long-term savings plan that's needed. And the other thing too I'll say is that like we all think that Bitcoin is forever, and I'd certainly love to believe that, but you shouldn't take that for granted. Don't let your greed blind you. It's definite that there are potential avenues that Bitcoin can fail. And it hasn't failed yet, but it doesn't mean that we are owed success. And for a lot of these people who are in the darknet, for them, they're just kind of like, you know what, that's just another risk on the table that I don't care to engage with. That thing could fail tomorrow. And they're right. Like they just don't share our enthusiasm. And our enthusiasm comes from a lot of ideology that we've brought with us that they have not brought with them. For many of us in the space, we are or started as libertarians. They did not. We are or started as gold bugs. They are not. So for them, the ideology is mismatched right off the bat. And so it doesn't really offer them a compelling store of value compared to the US dollars, which is effectively gold for them in their upbringing. The end. You guys still there?
Yeah,
I know you're silent.
No, that was good. That was a good point, and I agree, because when you take on risks like that, especially in the dark markets or illicit activity, you never know. Tomorrow may be your last day, just like Alexander Kraz. One day he's alive, next day he's lying on the toilet floor, dead. So even with 3 Lambos, $12 million home, probably many girlfriends, and I think he had $8 million worth of Bitcoin. Even then, I mean, that's it. He made his deal with the devil, and he had to pay. So, anyways, I'm sorry, Brian. Did you have any comments or questions?
The comments I were going to make were 30 minutes earlier, so I'm good at the moment.
Okay. All right. I think this is a good wrap up for Chris. I appreciate everything that you've done in this space. I enjoy your videos so much. I encourage everybody to please subscribe to Chris. His link to Bitcoin Uncensored is in the notes section. And please, even though he says he's a child molester and a drug addict, that's just a ploy, people. All right, just go ahead and he has there's some reasoning in his videos. Okay, so we'll go ahead and watch and learn from him. Chris, please tell everyone where they could find more about you if they want to contact you.
Yeah, all my information is at chrisderose.com, and I have a Patreon that I've just started recently where I'm putting a lot of my more salacious content. I would definitely tell you guys to check out my Weave interview. It is the parts that I could air, not the best parts. It is the modest parts, but it would hopefully get you thinking a little bit and get you exposed to some very interesting stuff. Weave is a guy who missed out on early Bitcoin because he was in jail. He had, depending on how you interpret things, he had quote-unquote hacked the entire Apple customer database, and for that he did 3 years in about 2009 to 12. So he missed out on early Bitcoin, but now he's this Trotsky kind of guy who's effectively writing propaganda to overthrow I think the American civilization from the Soviet, former Soviet countries, and he hates all kinds of black people and Jewish people. But meanwhile, there's some interesting stuff about his life that I've come to find out, such as his black brother and sister. And I ask him a lot of questions about that and get to know him as well as anybody can know him. He's an interesting and complex guy. So that's good content that's coming up in a couple of days, and I'd love to share that with you guys.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And Brian, if anybody, Brian is my producer. So if you want to be on this show, please contact Brian. And Brian, how can people get in contact with you?
You could leave a message on my YouTube channel. Actually, you could email me. And this is an email address I'd set up way before I knew about James Bond or he even had a channel. So it just so happens that it is smoothbind, SMOOTH, B as in Bravo, IND, 007 at gmail.com.
That is amazing. I didn't know that, Brian. I thought you just made that up. So I'll put Brian's email. I'll put that email in the notes section so you can go ahead and contact Brian. And if you want to give us $1 billion or 1 million Bitcoins, Brian will negotiate that contract on my behalf. So, all right, everyone. This is the conclusion of this show of James Bond Bitcoin Live. So for next time, stay tuned. Until next time, everyone. Bye-bye.